Welcome to the Precision Teaching Podcast. My name is Rick Cabina, and today I'm joined by Doug Kostowitz.
Hello, everybody.
And Sean Dachik.
Hi, everybody.
Our fellow co-host, Kerri Millico, has recently brought another precision teacher into the world, and she's not going to be able to join us tonight. But, Kerri, all of your fellow co-hosts congratulate you and your growing family and are very happy for you.
Yes, we are.
We have a few things to talk about in our Happenings and Happen segment. One is, I guess I just said the one thing. Kerri's good news. But second, we have the Precision Teaching the International Precision Teaching Conference, which is going to happen in December. The registration and program are up, and I encourage all of you, if you're looking for an event where you want to learn more about precision teaching, you want to interact with precision teachers, this is the place to go. We have a single-day track, which is different for us, which means everybody is going to be in the same room listening to dynamic speakers, and it's just such a great way of doing it. And well, without getting excited about all the people that will be there, we have guests, we have special events, we even have a cocktail hour, which Doug really likes.
I like the cocktail hour.
So please take a look at the registration and program and join us in December.
Where is that occurring, Rick?
Thank you. I should have mentioned that. It's happening at the lovely location of St. Pete Beach, which is in Florida.
Florida.
Yes. I don't know what the weather's going to be like at that point in time. We have on our registration or on the program guide that we'll have our meals outside if the weather cooperates, but not living there, I'm not sure what early December Florida weather's like.
I think it's all relative. I lived in Florida for 4 years, and I was more of a northern person, so I'd still be in short sleeves and jeans at that point. Everyone down there that lives in Florida is usually wrapped up in winter coats. So you're talking 50s, 55, 60, that kind of stuff. It's chilly if you're used to the 90 degrees every day, but I think that you'll be pleasantly surprised. I remember wearing shorts at Christmas time. So.
Oh, good.
Also, I looked into some flights. I'm up in Vermont, and there's a small commuter airport in St. Pete, and there's lots of direct flights from 50 different small airports across the United States. So please don't let the distance deter you from coming.
Wow.
We've been talking about possibly having a live event with the Precision Teaching Podcast there.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah, we might need to pull that off. So if you'd like to join us and give us some feedback live, well, you got to show up and see us in St. Pete. Let's move on to our email question. This is a short but nicely worded question. Can you use PT for high-level skills like art and poetry? And this comes from Carol in Davenport, Iowa. I don't know about you two, but there's just something cool about us having a listener in Davenport, Iowa.
Definitely. That was the first thing that's caught my eye. That was really cool, and I thought it was a really neat question.
Yeah. Well, what do you think? Can you use PT for art and poetry?
You know what? I mean, when it comes down to it, you're counting behavior. So if you can identify something, perhaps it's words written. I was thinking about this, words written or rhyming words or some kind of pinpoint, then you can, if you can measure it, you can chart it, and then you can make decisions on that chart. I think that normally, and this is my take, normally these are sort of like an art and a poetry is not it doesn't kind of fit real well. I mean, it's you're writing, you're being productive, and I think it's more based on the skills that build into art and poetry. I was thinking even like brushstrokes, but if you can count it, you can chart it to just see what's going on. That was my take.
No, that's definitely an interesting take. It's I'm glad to get your perspective on that, because the way I read the question, I immediately thought about it from a university level perspective of, say, art history or studying poetry in the classroom. And I was starting to sort of think through, so rather than producing art, such as paintings or sculptures, or producing poetry, I was thinking in terms of pinpoints on responding to pieces of art or poetry in the classroom. And I think there's some really great examples. I believe Morningside Academy writes about how they teach their students the different paint strokes or different painting techniques from world-class or Renaissance painters, and they have their students go identify them in museums.
I'm reminded also of when I was at Morningside, I remember reading a text where they talked about art. I don't remember watching what they do, but what you said makes sense. When we think of art, especially the visual arts, immediately a lot of people think of painting, but there's other forms of art. Sculpture, photography, different print things. I guess there's the performing arts too. When you think about the performing arts, right, there's music and theater, dance, film probably. And I guess it does go back to what Doug said, that if you can come up with a pinpoint, then you can monitor that and determine if someone's getting better at whatever the task is. Now, the thing with the visual arts and the performing arts, we live in the academic world, and because that's our strength, it's very easy for us to formulate pinpoints and to look at the structure. For reading, for example, we can come up with very good ways of saying, here's the structure. You have to become fluent with these skills so we can measure those skills. We know what they are and see how they affect subsequent skills. But in the visual arts and the performing arts, I don't know what those would be, and that becomes the tricky part.
Now, there's also an interesting sort of concept to wrap your head around, to stick with your reading example. So precision teaching, I think, lends itself very well to build skills to accuracy and fluency. So that there's some sort of stimulus happening in the environment, and you're trying to build it under control or build stimulus control. So if you have a stimulus of a page in the environment, you're trying to build a response of accuracy to that page or build frequency to that page. Where I think I'm just trying to wrap my head around for art and poetry, there's once you sort of build somebody's classical repertoire of art skills or poetry skills, that's when you start to veer off into, I think, more subjective terms of what is art and what is poetry, or what is good art or what is good poetry, or highly accurate art or highly accurate poetry.
That's a real good point. If we want people to get better at something, then we have a number of options to improve the skill. It's not just always looking at, okay, here are the pieces to it, but just practicing the integrated whole and receiving feedback on that in whichever form of art you're looking at would be a way of trying to produce improvement.
That's an interesting point. So if you take the feedback cycle in a precision teaching trial, so to stick with the reading example, so typically in the precision teaching literature, and I think probably Rick and Doug could speak to this better than I could, but for example, in the reading, where you would have where you would have somebody read aloud, and then they would get feedback from a peer or a teacher on their performance and then areas for improvement. That feedback cycle could still continue in art and poetry, to where there's a start and stop point for behavior, and then in between those start and stop points, some feedback's given from an artist or a poet.
The one thing I would like us to be clear upon is, although the performing arts and the visual arts might be different from what we're used to working with, they are skills and behaviors just like everything else. And when an artist creates something, I think back to an article that Skinner wrote about having a poem. And if we consider it behavior, then it just fits perfectly in with precision teaching. I think that, Carol, if this is something you're interested in doing, it would be great if you contact any of us offline through email, and we'd be happy to give you some suggestions. And certainly if you are going to go off on your own and try some things, we would love to hear back from you and get some feedback and hear how your precision teaching with art or poetry or whatever you're doing worked out. So thank you for that very good question. We have some education news. We talked about the Common Core, I don't know if it was the last podcast or maybe the one before that, but the Common Core is having a big impact on education in the United States. In this article that we have to share with you is called Calculator Use on Exams to Shift with Common Core. And this article talks about a controversy in education, and that is, should students be able to use the calculator when they're doing math, or should they not?
I'll tell you what, it's in the article. If you read, I read it a couple times. It's frustrating because what a calculator's often used for and what its purported use is very different. It can be, now we all know about in the precision teaching world that there are certain skills that you do need to bring to fluent levels. They're key element skills that work for everything else. And in math, it's argued that the child or student needs to be able to count fluently, perhaps number identification and counting, and then one of the other main ones are the 390 basic facts and being able to be fluent with those 390 basic facts. Now, what I'd like to see is that they're not using the calculator earlier, and they even talk about these kids need to be fluent with those. Now, the people that are against this is they want kids to experience the calculator provides them that greater, deeper understanding. And I can't imagine what a third grader, second grader, fourth grader would be doing a deeper understanding of math that they need a calculator on the four functions they talk about, the ability to go up to tangents, cosines, all that stuff. That's not really brought in until 10th, 11th grade. So it's a controversy it's a controversy because people are upset that they're not being allowed to use a calculator, or it's being proposed not to use a calculator. I like it. And it forces educators to come back to, these kids need to be able to know this stuff. And we dedicate that practice time. Now, we have some efficient practice procedures that will do that, but I actually like where most of the article goes. And what I don't like is the against arguments is missing the point of here, and that is the kids need those basic skills.
The calculator issue, I'm with you. The calculator issue is an important one because we live in a competitive world, period. You can, no matter what you think about it, when your child graduates, when you're out there on the marketplace, this is a true global economy, and everybody's competing for jobs, and those that have good math skills and are good in science. So you think about STEM, science and different technology, engineering, mathematics. All of that there's a huge push for people that are mathematically literate, not just mathematically literate, but very well versed. And I can see the calculator being used for certain things, but if you're always using that calculator and that becomes the way you understand things, then the calculator, you can't do math without that calculator, I guess is what I'm frightened about.
Yeah, that's what it comes down to. I guess I'm not railing against the calculator as a tool to assist in math, because there are math problems as you go further along into the higher grades where you're going to need the calculator, but you can't, if you want to get things done in a certain amount of time, you have to have those core skills fluent and be able to then incorporate the calculator at those higher order skills. So yes, but you need them both. And I don't see the need for the calculator early in a student's career.
Yeah, grades 3 to 5, it's a little disturbing to think that kids need a I was trying to think about, it's been a while since I've been teaching those grades, but what would you be using it for? Let's say you get to square roots. I get it. You have a real big number, but you should learn how to do square roots with some pretty basic numbers. I mean, that can be done without the use of a calculator.
Right. So
unless it's is there some pre-algebra with fractions that
but even still, I mean, if it's and correct me if I'm wrong, but they did say that the certain calculators will only have certain functions available on that calculator because it'll be an online calculator while they're so perhaps, I mean, that would be even cooler. So yeah, have a square root key, but they don't necessarily need an add, subtract, multiply, and divide key for a lot of things. Being able to work out a long division problem, you should be able to do that without a calculator because you should be able to do each of those steps.
I'm intrigued by the part in the article where they talk about the assessment manufacturers or the assessment consortiums having an online calculator. So it seems to me that that advancement in technology provides some possible middle ground between the two camps that are arguing for or against calculator use on this assessment. I think for the camp that is interested in having some sort of calculator, I think there's a way of setting that up to gather data on whether or not that would be beneficial to the assessment. So what I'm thinking of is if the calculator is online, perhaps the assessment consortiums could put it on for maybe 5 questions. I'm just tossing that number out there. 5 questions that get at sort of what this camp's proposing, that it would be calculations too difficult, but maybe there's some sort of word problem step that they feel like the kids should be able to solve still. Mm-hmm. And then they could gather data if it is online.
There were quotes from some people, and some of them I was puzzled over. For example, here's a quote. "It's absolutely true that kids need to be able to compute without calculators, but that's only part of what they need." And then it goes on to prohibit them on the exams in grades 3 to 5, even when they are very useful ways students would use them to get to higher level thinking, is a mistake. It constrains the depth of the test problems you provide. I mean, isn't that saying that, look, our kids can't handle certain problems unless they have a calculator?
Right. Exactly.
This is a divisive issue. And, of course, this is in the context, it's receiving lots of attention because this story talks about banning the use of the calculator. And if you ban the use of a calculator, a lot of people teach to the test, and that would affect the classroom and the way they do things. That was another issue that I think you can see if you're reading between the lines in this story. We'll see how this plays out. I'm sure there'll be, as Sean, as you were pointing out, with the different consortiums, the assessment consortiums, I read some of their, I went to their websites and was reading up on some of their recommendations, and clearly there has to be uniformity, because if you have a Common Core and the Common Core has standards, and some of those standards say that students need to learn things by memory. Well, if they need to learn certain things by memory doesn't mean punching in keys in a calculator. That brings us to our piece of science news. And the science story that we have this month for you is the ability to move to a beat linked to brain's response to speech. Musical training may sharpen language processing. So we have an interesting story here. If you can move to a beat, and if you can do it really well, apparently what this news story is telling us is that type of then training would sharpen language processing.
Yeah, I'm not sure I quite understand the claim. I think I understand the experimental procedures. And I guess what I mean by that is, so they had a metronome playing in the environment, and then they tested how kids tapped, or their reaction time, I'm assuming, to the metronome. And they found that students who were able to tap to that pretty well were also able to tap pretty well to when when the sound "da" was said. I think it seems to me, I don't know the research that they're pulling from, but I guess I would need a little bit more convincing that tapping to "da" indicates language processing or something different than the metronome.
I've read this, and I thought exactly like the whole bunch of questions popped in my head, and then I finally congealed for me at the end of this article, and I said, you know what, this is the classic case of somebody finding a correlation between two things, and because I'm thinking to myself, how is tapping music produce language that really wasn't that well developed? Obviously, this is only a news article, and it's hitting you with you're going to immediately jump. Given this, you're going to immediately jump to my kid plays violin, so then they'll speak Spanish or English very well, and that's not what this is saying. But right. I think it's a case of correlation, taking the people making a lot about a correlation without a lot of it doesn't make a lot of sense.
When we do research, it's always instructive to classify research into 3 different broad categories. The first category would be description, exploratory type of research. The second level would be correlational and maybe some more descriptive. And the third level would be experimental. Now, within those categories, there's all types of ways that you can do good science. And each level of that science has its place and gives you information. So one's not better than the other. But what we can say is one type of conducting science allows us to make different claims than another type of science. And what you're saying, Doug, is what I got into also. I read this, went to the source and looked more at the journal article, because the people who report this, I'm not sure how they actually are reporting it, if they're science reporters and they read the study and they're the ones making the change. But what they find in this article is that when these subjects have smaller variability when they tap to the beat, that they look at that and they match that up with those neural responses to sound. And the article has the headline, and too, when you read what they're saying, they're making a pretty big claim here, in that is, hey, we have music therapy, and if we can, the picture that they have, it's a real cute picture with kids playing the drums. They're having a good time, and they're drawing this connection, which is a causal connection, but you can only draw a causal connection if you do an experimental study. Whenever you do one of these, and this is very common, you get this a lot with studies where they are looking at, and this is what you're saying with correlations, when you correlate this thing that's happening in the brain with this other behavior, then you can say, okay, there's an association that's going on here. So these things are linked, and now that they're linked, that's one thing that we know. But making claims beyond that is very dangerous, because when you're a scientist, you have to stick with whatever type of study that you did. I read at the end, and the authors said, the last sentence to their article, they said, these findings also suggest that the acquisition of reading and beat synchronization ability may relate, because both rely on consistent timing with the auditory system. As long as they're saying may and possible, that's okay. But when you start looking at claims that, hey, if you do this, if you do musical training, then you're going to do better with language processing, that's just a huge leap. And we always need to be careful that when we read these articles, we're understanding them for what they're telling us.
And when you talk about correlation and you find relations, I always talk about a real common one, that the sale of ice cream and murders are correlated. And people are like, what are you talking about? Well, there's a relationship between those two. But what it really comes down to is when the heat goes up, people buy more ice cream. When the heat goes up, people commit more violent crimes such as murders. So the notion is, even when you have a correlation, they may be unrelated to each other and related to some other factor. And so that's the hesitancy that you're talking about, Rick, and that I don't see. Everything is kind of said, I think it's given a lot more play in this article, and perhaps even in the source, as you mentioned, even with the words may and things like that. I think it leads people on. So I was just a little frustrated with that, but watch out for those types of relationships when you hear about them on TV. And if they don't make sense, there's a good reason why they probably don't make sense.
Yeah, as a simple example, let's say there's something related to being able to follow a beat with language ability. And you do a study and you find, wow, these students are related. Well, you start when it comes to causality, you have to ask, well, is it because people have this ability that they have language, or is it something else and they have language and then they have this ability? You don't really quite know that from just looking at a connection. You don't know which way that relationship will go.
I think it comes down to claims, and that's regardless of the interesting findings, and they are interesting, as you pointed out. There's not better or worse. It's just making sure to match the proper claims to the type of research is helpful to communicate those findings to others.
Yeah. It would have to be. Here's another thing too that people have to understand. This is a very interesting study, and let's just pretend that everything that they find is true, that there is a causal relationship. Even if that's the case, it doesn't mean we're going to start teaching the kids to play the drums and they're going to learn to read better. reading is a very specific task, and this ability, although it may be part of it, if you want to teach kids to read, you could spend 15 minutes a day teaching them to be better drummers, but you're going to have a lot better success if you directly start teaching them letter sounds and how to blend. And we don't want to spend all of this time necessarily on these other abilities when, if you want to teach someone a skill directly, you need to see how do they respond to that skill directly. And that's, again, this could be important, but we don't want to rush to judgment, and we don't want to rush to start having kids do all these other things rather than teach them the task directly. So an interesting finding here in an interesting study. I think that after this podcast is over, I'm going to start doing some tapping.
And if you, I'll go da.
There we go.
Da.
Well, let's move on to our interview.
I would like to welcome Brad Frieswyk to the Precision Teaching Podcast. Brad, welcome.
Thank you, Rick. I'm very happy to be here.
I'd like to start our interview by asking you, how did you get into precision teaching?
Well, it goes back a while. Actually, my interest in fluency building for educational purposes started back when I was doing my undergraduate and graduate work at Western Michigan University. At the time, the chart was not taught there. I'm not sure if it is today. But I was working with Dick Malott, and part of his teaching behavior analysis system, and he incorporated SAFMEDs into his introductory courses. So for each unit, there would be definitions, and the students would have to memorize these definitions and then be able to go through their decks in a certain period of time. And when I was teaching these classes, I noticed a huge jump in the performance of the student based on how fluent they got at doing their SAFMEDs. We were also using a program, a computer-based fluency program called ThinkFast, which probably a lot of people listening to this podcast have heard of. That's was developed by Joe Parsons.
Yeah,
Not
Joe
sure
Parsons.
If they're still, are they still producing that? Do you know?
I don't know, but I do think a lot of people should know about that program because it was very well done and it received a lot of attention.
Yeah, so, we were doing some research. I was working with one of his doctoral students at the time and just comparing using different fluency methods, SAFMEDs versus ThinkFast versus just copying definitions, C-writes. But all of this, like I said, was done without the chart. I wasn't introduced to the chart until later after I finished my master's work at Western. I went to work for Morningside Academy in Seattle. And that's where I first learned the chart.
And what did you do when you were working for Morningside?
Well, that initial work was sort of an internship. I was teaching some classes, a reading class and a math class. And in both of those cases, we were using the direct instruction program and incorporating the chart and fluency building with the activities that, were put forward in the direct instruction program. So it was a fantastic experience, and I learned a lot. And especially what I took away from it was how much more of an impact you could see using the chart than just using these other fluency building methods without a data recording system for it to see the change in performance over time. The change in performance that I was seeing was just on quizzes. When I was at Western, we'd give the quiz. I'd see a difference in score. We weren't keeping track of the time that it was taking for people to complete the quiz. All I could see was a change in percent correct, which I could see, but I really was not getting how these types of activities were impacting the behavior without being able to see it visually on the chart.
So you're first introduced to this concept of fluency, and you see that that's powerful, and then as you move forward, you say, there's this other thing that's important to it, which is the chart. So now these things are starting to come together. Where do you go after that when you're done with Morningside?
Well, from Morningside, I went to work at Malcolm X College under Joe Lang in the Personalized Curriculum Institute. And at the time, Morningside had a guarantee that they would be able to take a child and move them forward at least 2 years in their lowest area of performance, and do that in one academic year. And they were meeting that guarantee. And that guarantee has changed. I don't want to speak for Morningside, but I believe it's up to 4 years now in some areas. But when I went to work for Malcolm X College, what I found was when we were working with these older learners, these were young adults who had graduated from high school, had a high school diploma, but were not able to take what at the time was called the College Board Placement Exam, were not able to pass that, so they could not take college credit courses. Working with these slightly older learners, we were able to get those same results Morningside was getting in a year. We were able to get them in just a semester. So
wow.
We were seeing gains of 2 to 4 years in these areas of reading, writing, and math in just a semester with some of our students at Malcolm X. And that was extremely powerful, but it wasn't that we were doing anything differently. It was just the difference in the repertoire of the learner.
I'm always interested when I hear these stories. So here you are, basically discovering this is the solution. Across all community colleges should look at what you've done and adopt it. What happens when you're done with that? Why don't people look at this and say, there's really something to this. Maybe we ought to do it.
People do look at that, and they do say, this is something that we ought to do. Unfortunately, here comes a little bit of the reality is the cost of doing it versus the cost of doing some other things that are being offered that are less effective. Unfortunately, when we get out into the world of education, what we're seeing a lot more of now is that the contingencies of cost are far outweighing the contingencies of effectiveness. So at Malcolm X, but, going back to that time in the mid-'90s, back at Malcolm X College, the Chicago school system did see this. We were able to run a pilot program that got fantastic results. We were invited to become an external partner to the Chicago Public Schools. That led to Morningside partnering, back up with Malcolm X. And Joe Lang and Kent Johnson, spearheading this program into the Chicago Public Schools, where we then took on 22 schools, and we were able to get fantastic results with them as an external partner. And that's who I was working under at that time. It switched from Malcolm X College to then being Morningside Learning Systems, working for them directly. And we were able to get fantastic results. But, again, the cost thing comes in because you're having to train people to implement these things. You have to have a coach there at the school every day. You have to come in and continuously do professional development. You have to purchase all of these additional materials. And while it, went very well, what ends up happening is the cost thing comes back to us, and someone else says, hey, I can get these results for less money, and they're more concerned about the short-term consequence of the money than they are about the 2 to 3 years down the road, where are these students going to be?
I'd like to know, too, if anyone could actually get those results. Yeah, I mean, that just seems like a way to push out the good thing and just buy something cheaper on the hope that it produces those incredible results.
Yeah. Well, we have the results. You're forcing me into a cynical corner here. But
I do that. Sorry.
That's okay. We do have those results. The issue at this point is that the testing has changed. The testing model has changed since then. They're not using the same tests. So comparing our results back then to the test results that are coming through now, it's not comparing apples to apples. So that that's probably the biggest issue. But I'll tell you, I met about a year and a half ago with the chancellor of the City Colleges of Chicago, and I showed her what had happened at Malcolm X back in the 90s. What were the results? We had those results, and with them, she became very wide-eyed and was very interested. However, she's considering doing a program like that against several computer-based programs that aren't as effective but don't use human resources. So you don't have to pay to train people. You don't have to pay people hourly to do this stuff. You don't have to buy all the materials. You're just paying a flat price per student or per learner. And, if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But I'm not sure that they get that feedback in time for it to be as effective a feedback as the feedback of cost is.
So if you were doing precision teaching, if someone said, Brad, you are now the superintendent of all Chicago schools, and you have to implement a precision teaching model across all of these people, are we looking at just having a new position as this quality control or whatever that precision teaching person is, or what does that look like for someone who would like to adopt this?
Well, I think the answer for us, Rick, with precision teaching, it really lies in the future with developing better computer-based programs that utilize the chart and that utilize, these principles of precision teaching. In what we're doing now, and I know we're going to talk about that, we use the charts. We use paper-based charts, and that's all we're going to use because we want to, provide very high quality, but we're a small group, right, doing this on a small scale. If you're talking about rolling something out with a large school district like a Chicago Public Schools or New York City public school system, what you're really looking at is you need to be able to push that cost way down, and the only way I see of doing that is to do it through a computer-based model.
I have a hard time disagreeing with you. I review articles and I read the literature quite a bit. And it's always, I just reviewed this one article, and it was a study where they talk about how important practice is, but they recognize that school systems don't do it for whatever reason, and so they looked at CAI, computer-assisted instruction, and they tested these various things. So I think what you're saying is just the reality of the situation. But I oftentimes come to the conclusion that, hey, what we know about precision teaching is the learning channel of C type is not on the same learning channel as C write. And
Right.
I think that
That's
can
right.
have very important ramifications that nobody's even thinking of.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And this is why, well, two things. One is when I was at Western, one of the things that we were looking at was what was the performance of students that were using the Think Fast program, and they were learning definitions, so they were typing the definitions, okay? When given a vocabulary word, they were typing the definitions versus someone who was given the vocabulary word and then was writing out the definition, all right? And then on the final test, everybody was writing out the definition. The issue is that the students who were given the practice where they were writing out the definition, so doing the same behavior that we were expecting them to do when it came time to take the final test, they ended up doing better on that final test. So the behavior that you're looking at, you want that, the one that you're practicing, to be the one that you want to get up, the one that you are going to be testing at the end. In my later work with our grammar program, I have been pushed and pushed and pushed to create a computer-based program of that, based on that series. And I've resisted it for this reason, because we're doing sentence combining exercises. What we want the students to be able to do is write these sentences, these different sentences based on the more basic sentences, the more, them to be able to look at these couple of basic sentences and write a more complex sentence based on those. I want them to be able to write that out. If I have them typing, then that is different. A lot of what we found in a lot of this is through interviewing people that were having practice these problems. When they are typing, they are looking word to word, copying, or sometimes even letter to letter. Like you learn to type, you're hitting this letter, this letter, this letter, this letter, or this word, this word, this word, this word. And when you're done, sometimes you can't even tell me the last, 3 or 4 words that you typed. When you're writing, there's more of a tendency to look and take a chunk or maybe a whole sentence and repeat it back to yourself as you're writing it out. Does that make sense? So you can't look at one page and then write on another page without looking, which is what you can do when you're typing. A lot of times you're not looking at your fingers, you're just reading off a paper and typing. Where when you're writing something out, you're looking at that page and then you have to look over to where you're writing. So it's hard to explain. You can kind of see the difference, though, in what I'm talking about, right? And we end up
Absolutely.
we end up getting better results with that writing and more transfer to other skills when we have them actually writing it out. So when someone says to me, "Hey, we need to get a computer-based version of this," I don't know how to do that without turning it into typing, where the student wouldn't have to look at what they were typing. They're looking at something else and copying it. And I just don't based on this experience and based on the testing that we've done, I don't believe that we would get as good of results with that.
Your answer is a very good precision teaching answer because it gets at what is precise about the way students are taking in information and responding to it. And because hardly anyone pays attention to this, nobody understands that behaviors shaped up in one way are different from behaviors that are supposed to occur in another way. And those can have not just, they can have profound impact because what we know through research is that whenever you do something, when you learn something, there's a biological component to that, and that is the brain. And we know that in the area that processes writing or whatever you want to call it in reading, those happen in different places. So very well, what you're talking about is true on multiple levels. Very important for people to understand. Let me ask you, let me move you forward. You've had a very rich experience and career, and everything that you talked about is moving you forward, and you've been a successful textbook publisher. You've taken these important precision teaching and also other instructional tactics, and now you have your own organization where you're helping students with autism. Could you talk to us about what is your organization and what do you do? What does it look like? And who do you help?
Sure. So I started BGF Performance Systems back in 1999. That was after I left Morningside Learning Systems. And since then, we've done a lot of work in schools, a lot of work with development of educational materials. Those external partnerships in schools, they've happened in very low-performing schools. They've also happened in very high-performing schools, using precision teaching all along. We published in my partnership with Arthur Wimby and Myra Linden. We published the Thinking Through Grammar series, which is the series I was just talking about with the sentence combining to teach the parts of speech. And now, in addition to partnerships with schools and other, educational materials, we're also doing a lot of work applying precision teaching methods to in-home support for autism. And honestly, when we first started doing this, we were mainly working at the schools. A lot of my early projects just involved helping set up special education classrooms so that we were, making sure that every student was moving ahead. And when we started going out into homes and providing ABA therapy services using the chart, I was absolutely shocked, Rick, absolutely shocked at how many clients came to us who had been getting ABA, in quotation marks, ABA therapy services from people who were not taking data. They were not adjusting their approaches based on the data since they weren't taking it. And some of these clients had reported to us that they had actually been dropped from programs because they weren't moving ahead. And all we needed to do was start taking data, start using the chart, and these kids started just flying, just moving forward so fast. Parents were absolutely amazed. Everyone who's doing ABA therapy with children with autism should be using the chart.
With your approach, a lot of our listeners, I'm guessing a number of them, are familiar with applied behavior analysis and what that looks like. What's different when you add precision teaching to your intervention?
Well, like I said, the data, being able to see the change in performance, even just tiny, tiny changes in performance so that you know that something is working and you can stick with it, or you can adjust it in order to make it more effective. The information, I mean, if you're working without a chart, you're really just blind. This is a problem in our field because it's new, this, whole being a BCBA, it's new. There's a very high demand for BCBAs right now. When you come out of school, you're almost guaranteed a job as a BCBA. There's just a very, very high demand for it. And not enough people are getting good, solid supervision after they get out of school. They're often stuck straight into a supervisory position. So they don't know when they're not getting the information that they need to adjust a protocol. A lot of times what they're doing is they are just implementing a protocol that they learned as an ABA therapist. They haven't really learned how that protocol was developed or how to adjust that protocol. So I'm not sure that they even miss the fact that they're not getting this information. But that's really what it is. It's kind of like you're driving a car with the windshield blacked out. You can't see where you're going. And when they don't get to where they are trying to go, they say, you know what? I'm going to switch cars. I'm going to get out of here. Where we have a very clear view of where we are going and where we've been and whether or not we're getting there to where we're going by using the chart. It's all the feedback and information that we need. A huge, huge part of the social interaction that we work with, on with kids, if we want to teach them to be able to interact socially, it's latency. Latency of response is a huge thing. And how do you see that if you're not keeping time? Appropriate answers or responses, they might get 100% correct, but the response happened, 2 minutes after the opportunity for it to stimulate, additional social interaction, for example. All of this information, we need the chart in order to see it.
From a practical standpoint, when you bring someone on who is new at BGF, how long does it take for you to get them up and running?
Well, we're lucky here in Chicago. We have the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, and in their ABA program, they teach the chart. So the people who come to work for us who have been through a program like that uses the chart, we're able to get them up and running pretty quickly. We do hire from outside of that group as well, and that takes us a little bit longer. Usually what we'll do is we will hire them under a very heavily supervised situation where they're learning the chart, but we don't let BCBAs who don't know the chart manage cases on their own until we are very confident that they're up to speed and are able to use the chart to make those database decisions. Because that's the job. When you're managing a case, you need to be able to make the database decisions. You need to understand that tool. To answer your question, it varies based on their experience level. But, people who come to us from a program that teaches the chart, they get up and running much faster.
On the chart, we have a space for 3 people. The manager, who works with the person on a daily basis, the advisor that would give advice to the manager or the student on a weekly basis, and then the supervisor, who would be a monthly basis person. You are in the position of being a supervisor. Have you been able to come across any interesting, or have you made any interesting, even organizational types of discoveries? Because when you're at the top and you're looking at all these charts, for example, I'm guessing you'll be able to tell the difference between how effective is one person from another because you have the chart and you could quantify the learning that's going on with each individual behavior analyst.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. When we see these charts and you're able to see from team to team, and our clinical director, who's Nicole Sissel, and I know you've met Nicole, it's her job to do exactly that, to look at the charts across all of the teams. And she can tell just by looking at the charts where we need to do more training. Like I said, it would make it so much more difficult. Without the chart, it would be something like, oh, on this day we check in with this team and do this training. Well, maybe that team doesn't need it. And we can tell that by the chart. It saves us so much time.
Have you been able to make any discoveries in terms of, hey, this particular approach or this way of doing something works really well with maybe this child or a number of children? Have you had any breakthroughs like that in terms of, or then again, you may have such a diversity of students and they're working on so many different things that not enough things pop up in the same kind of programming?
Well, we do see things like that pop up, but they're maybe not as stand out as we can say, oh, yeah, then we can take this and in the way that we were implementing it, put it over here with this child. It's very, very individual in the way that we have to program. But, again, that's where the chart saves us, right? Because the chart shows this individual compared against himself over time. So all the protocols end up looking differently based on what child you're working with, and the speed at which we expect kids to get through those protocols looks differently depending on, which of our learners you're working with. But that's another place where the chart really saves us.
Brad, what advice would you give to an up-and-coming BCBA who's not fortunate enough to live in Chicago or go to a place like Chicago School? What advice would you give them so that they could become better behavior analysts working with children in context of what you are learning with precision teaching and charting?
Is this where I plug your book?
I wasn't going there, but sure.
Well, yeah. So sometimes, it's not taught at your school or university. I say get on the SCS listserv, get a copy of Rick Cabina's book, get a copy of the Handbook of the Standard Acceleration Chart, and start just playing with it a little bit with one or two clients, just to kind of see. Maybe share that chart with the community on the SCS listserv. And it's really easy to get feedback that way, right? You throw up a chart, you say, hey, I'm working with this client. This is what it's looking like so far. Does anybody have some ideas? Or this is what I think is happening. What do other people think? The age of computers has made it really easy for us to do something like that. So, it wouldn't just be a self-study. You can go to, some of our PT communities here for feedback. And I would say that would be the thing that I would do. And I'll tell you, if no one else, none of the other ABA providers in your area are using the chart or taking data, that's going to put you heads and shoulders above them. And when parents start to learn about what you're doing and see how effective that you are doing it, you are going to be the premier program in whatever area you're in for these types of services.
We are moving towards the end of our interview. I always like to ask if there are any questions that I should have asked you that I didn't, or any comments you'd like to say before we leave.
I can't think of any questions that I wanted you to ask that you haven't. It's been a pleasure doing the interview. I think that it's fantastic that you do this, and you've sort of become our resident, I'm not sure how I want to put it, but you are our chart thumper, right? And I think you're doing a fantastic job, and I really appreciate that you make things like the podcast available for people to learn about what other people are doing with the chart and maybe new ways of applying the chart. I think that's really great.
Well, thank you for those kind words. I have to say, this is my pleasure because I get to talk to interesting people like you, and I get to find out all of these new, wonderful things that each person is doing, and it is just very nice to hear about all of the great things that our community of applied scientists are doing. And as part of the show, having a chance to showcase someone and hear what they're doing and learn from their wisdom is wonderful. So let me thank you for taking time out of your busy day to talk with the Precision Teaching audience.
Thank you, Rick. It's been a pleasure.
As usual, that was another fantastic discussion and interview. On behalf of Doug Kostowitz and Sean Datchick, I'm Rick Cabina, and thank you for listening to the Precision Teaching Podcast.